She entered the palace that morning wrapped in the same quiet elegance that had defined her public life for years, her posture straight, her expression composed, a gentle smile resting effortlessly on her lips. There was nothing in the summons that hinted at alarm, no urgency threaded through the wording, no subtle cues suggesting crisis. It had been presented as routine, another scheduled conversation, another procedural update, another obligation in a life shaped by ceremony and expectation. Catherine had attended countless meetings like this before. She anticipated nothing more than a brief exchange of formalities, perhaps a measured discussion, a minor adjustment to an already crowded calendar. But the instant her heels struck the marble floor just beyond the palace entrance, something inside her tightened. It was not dramatic, not loud, just a shift, small yet undeniable. The kind of shift that only reveals itself to someone who has lived within these walls long enough to understand their rhythms. The palace was usually alive in its own restrained way, discreet footsteps echoing faintly through corridors, quiet conversations layered beneath the hum of routine, doors opening and closing with purpose. That morning, however, the energy felt suspended. Conversations softened as she passed, not stopped entirely, just lowered as if instinctively cautious. A few members of staff glanced at her, then quickly away, their expressions carefully neutral. The silence was not peaceful, it was loaded. It pressed down on her shoulders like unseen weight. It was the kind of silence that carries knowledge, the kind that tells you something has already been decided. With each step toward the meeting room, her instincts sharpened. She had learned to read subtleties here, how posture could signal tension, how eye contact could signal alliance or distance. The palace spoke in coded gestures, and that morning it spoke loudly through restraint. When she entered the room, the unease crystallized into something colder. Everything was immaculate, almost unnaturally so. The chairs were positioned in exact symmetry, aligned with rigid precision. Folders rested on the table in perfect stacks, edges squared, corners unbent. The table itself gleamed beneath the soft overhead lighting, its polished surface reflecting fragments of faces and hands like fractured mirrors. It felt less like a meeting and more like a prepared stage. The faces waiting for her were composed to the point of discomfort. Neutral expressions stretched too tightly across controlled features. Jaws were clenched subtly beneath polite smiles. Hands were folded with intention rather than ease. Even the way they breathed felt measured, rehearsed. Neutrality, she realized, can sometimes conceal more than emotion ever could. There was restraint in the room, but not the gentle kind born of empathy. This restraint was deliberate, protective, defensive. Louis's evaluations had always been described to her as precautionary, routine developmental monitoring, responsible parenting amplified by royal scrutiny, a safeguard, not a warning. She had accepted those explanations outwardly, though never without a quiet current of unease humming beneath her calm exterior. A mother's intuition does not rest easily when something feels incomplete. She had noticed things, small delays, subtle hesitations, moments that lingered too long. But she had also trusted the structure around her, trusted the experts presented to her, trusted the system that promised to protect her children. That morning, the tone told her something had shifted. The conversation began formally, but the words lacked their usual softness. There were no cushioning phrases, no careful reassurances placed gently around difficult information. The language was direct, heavy. Each sentence seemed to land with calculated weight. She felt the change in her body before her mind fully explained it. Her breath grew shallow. Her hands resting lightly on her lap stiffened. The air seemed to narrow, as if the room were quietly closing in. Then came the terminology. Clinical phrases delivered with practiced steadiness, words that carried permanence, descriptions that did not suggest possibility but inevitability. The tone was not speculative, it was conclusive. The meaning reached her before the sentences were fully formed. She saw it in their eyes before she processed it in her mind. This was not a conversation about observation. This was not a temporary concern. This was not a "we will continue to monitor." It was confirmation. In that suspended moment, time seemed to fracture. The polished table, the quiet hum of the lights overhead, the faint rustle of paper, everything sharpened unnaturally as though her senses had intensified in self-defense. Her thoughts moved faster than the voices across from her. Louis, his laughter echoing through the gardens, his small hand wrapped tightly around her finger, the way he would bury his fac. E against her shoulder when overwhelmed, the way he sometimes paused mid-sentence, searching. Every memory rearranged itself in an instant, each moment reframed under this new and devastating light. The professionals continued speaking, outlining findings, next steps, projections. Their tone remained measured, almost detached. They spoke in data points and medical categories, in percentages, in developmental markers, in long-term management. But for Catherine, the language dissolved into something far simpler and far more brutal. Her son's future had just shifted. The room felt colder. The weight of centuries of royal expectation, public scrutiny, tradition, all of it seemed to press inward at once. This was not just a medical reality. It was a personal earthquake unfolding inside an institution built on stability. And in the space between their words and her silence, Catherine understood something with painful clarity. Nothing about this morning was routine. Nothing about this was minor. And the life she had walked into the palace with only moments earlier would not be the same life she walked out with. Her composure did not waver, it shattered. The sound of her chair scraping violently against the polished floor sliced through the suffocating silence of the room. It echoed longer than it should have, sharp and jarring, as though even the furniture resisted what had just been spoken. Her breath broke apart in uneven fragments, one inhale too sharp, the next too shallow. Tears welled instantly, spilling down her cheeks before she could summon the discipline to stop them. They came not as quiet drops, but as a flood, uninvited, unstoppable. A tremor ran through her hands, subtle at first, then undeniable. It was as if her body itself was rejecting the reality being delivered in clinical tones across the table. Her pulse roared in her ears, drowning out portions of the ongoing explanation. The room blurred at the edges. Words like progressive, management, and long-term implications floated in fragments, detached from structure, heavy and cruel. Her thoughts erupted in chaotic succession. How did this advance without me knowing everything? Who had been informed before I was? How long has this been understood? Why didn't the urgency match the severity? Why was I not warned sooner? Each question collided violently with the next, offering no relief, only deeper panic. For a fleeting moment, she felt not like a future queen, not like a composed public figure, but simply a mother blindsided. And then, almost as if rehearsed, the palace machinery came alive. It happened swiftly, efficiently, almost seamlessly. A subtle nod from one advisor triggered a chain reaction. Phones were silenced, screens dimmed, internal communication channels tightened within seconds. Doors that had been left slightly ajar were quietly closed. The atmosphere shifted from disclosure to damage control. The priority was not emotional support. It was containment. Information was compartmentalized, access restricted, conversations truncated mid-sentence. Staff outside the room were redirected under vague pretenses. The choreography was precise, almost mechanical. No raised voices, no panic, just cold efficiency. Catherine barely registered when someone stepped closer to her side. A hand hovered near her arm, not intrusive but guiding, gentle yet firm. She was escorted from the room not as a comforted mother, but as a volatile variable to be shielded from exposure. The private corridor swallowed her quickly. Away from visible staff, away from waiting eyes, away from potential witnesses. Her heels, once steady and deliberate, faltered against the stone floor. The sound echoed hollowly in the long, narrow passage. Aides walked slightly behind her, close enough to intervene if she stumbled, distant enough to preserve the illusion of dignity. But dignity felt fragile. Witnesses later described the image in hushed recollection, her face drained of color, lips trembling faintly despite her effort to steady them, shoulders curved inward as though something immense had settled there without warning. The regal posture the public admired was gone, replaced by the unmistakable weight of private devastation. It was as if something irreversible had taken root in her spine, bending it under invisible gravity. Behind her, the instructions spread with surgical speed. Do not speculate. Do not repeat. Do not acknowledge. The revelation was to remain sealed within those walls, locked behind protocol and polished statements. The narrative, if and when it emerged, would be shaped carefully, strategically timed. The institution had survived centuries through control of information. It would not surrender that control easily. But truths of that magnitude have a pulse of their own. They press against silence. They strain against walls. They find fissures in even the most fortified structures. And while the palace tightened its grip, unaware or unwilling to admit it, something had already shifted beyond containment. Because when the truth is heavy enough, silence cannot hold it forever. You have not enough humanizer words left. upgrade your surfer plan. In the days that followed, sleep became fragmented and thin. Catherine lay awake in the quiet hours before dawn, her mind replaying the past few years with merciless clarity. Every milestone, every hesitation, every fleeting moment she had once dismissed as ordinary childhood variation now returned sharpened and relentless. Memory, once warm and comforting, turned forensic. What had she missed? She saw him again as the world knew him, Prince Louis, the bright spark of the family, the mischievous grin that broke protocol during balcony appearances, the exaggerated faces at public events, the playful defiance that sent photographers scrambling for the perfect shot. His laughter had always carried pure and infectious, cutting through ceremony with refreshing honesty. The public adored him for that spontaneity. He was the child who made royalty feel human. But now, in the privacy of her thoughts, the footage replayed differently. Beneath the charm there had been subtleties, small pauses that lingered just a second too long, words that formed carefully, sometimes delayed as if they had to travel farther to reach his lips, sentences that faltered and restarted. At the time, she had told herself that children develop unevenly, that personalities bloom at different speeds. She had chosen reassurance over worry. Then there was the unsteadiness. She remembered afternoons on the palace lawn, sunlight spilling across the grass as Louis ran ahead of his siblings. Occasionally his stride would falter, a stumble that seemed disproportionate to the terrain, a brief loss of balance that he masked quickly with laughter. She had rushed toward him once instinctively, only for him to wave her off with determination. "I'm fine," he had insisted. And perhaps he had been, until he was. There were moments during conversations when his gaze drifted mid-sentence. His eyes would lose focus, not in distraction exactly, but in distance, as though something internal had called him away without warning. She would repeat his name softly, sometimes twice. He would blink, return, smile again. It was subtle, easy to dismiss. At public appearances, the pattern became harder to ignore. After only a few minutes of waving from balconies or standing beneath relentless camera flashes, fatigue would wash over him visibly. His shoulders drooped, his expression dulled. He would press himself against her side, gripping her hand tightly, drawing strength from contact. The world interpreted it as affection, as clinginess, as the natural overwhelm of a young child under bright lights. Online, the clips circulated with fond commentary. "He's just shy, he's bored, he's adorable." Millions watched and laughed, charmed by what they saw as innocence and childhood unpredictability. But inside the palace walls, the interpretations grew quieter and more careful. It was the nanny who first spoke the words gently, almost apologetically. She had guided children through every developmental stage, watched them stumble and flourish, seen the vast spectrum of normal growth. Her experience had sharpened her instincts. She knew when a variation was harmless and when it deserved closer attention. Louis, she explained with caution, struggled with certain multi-step instructions longer than expected. He sometimes froze when overstimulated, not in visible panic, not with tears or protest, but in stillness, a kind of internal pause. His coordination was inconsistent. Some days he moved fluidly, other days his balance seemed uncertain. His responses occasionally arrived delayed, as if he were processing through unseen layers before speaking. She did not use dramatic language. She did not speculate recklessly. She simply suggested observation. Catherine had listened quietly, because deep down, beneath reassurance and public composure, she had already felt it. The instinct had been there long before the confirmation, soft but persistent, a mother's awareness that something was unfolding beyond what cameras captured. She had sensed the difference in the way he tired, the way he sometimes withdrew, the way certain tasks seemed heavier for him than for others his age. She had hoped she was imagining it. She had prayed she was being overly cautious. But now, as memory rearranged itself into sharper meaning, she understood something with painful clarity. The signs had not been sudden. They had been whispering for years. "You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan. There exists a bond between a mother and her child that no protocol, no rule, no polished decree can ever silence. It is instinct, primal and unshakable." Catherine felt it in the tiniest of gestures, how Louis's small fingers lingered on hers when the world became too bright, too loud, too much. She felt it in the faint exhaustion hiding behind his mischievous smile, in the subtle way his gaze sometimes flickered away mid-sentence, as though he were carried elsewhere by forces she could not see. It was an unspoken language, a deep, ineffable knowledge of her child's inner world, one that whispered truths even the walls of the palace tried to conceal. When she dared to voice her concern, the response was immaculate in appearance, yet hollow in impact. The advisors, trained to soothe and reassure, framed developmental differences as entirely normal. Every hesitation, every minor stumble, every fleeting pause was explained away as a natural variation in growth. The pressures of public life were invoked as mitigating circumstances. She was reminded again and again that boys mature at different rates, that patience was a mother's greatest virtue. Polished phrases were repeated with precision, soft smiles offered like balm, but they could not reach the gnawing certainty in her chest. Patience did not soothe fear. It did not answer the questions that twisted relentlessly in her mind. And so, in the dead of night, Catherine began her vigil. Alone in her quarters when the palace corridors were empty and the hush of long-forgotten clocks filled the silence, she replayed family footage with painstaking care. Frame by frame, movement by movement, she watched Louis as though looking for secrets embedded in time itself. There was a birthday moment that had once felt innocent, when he did not respond immediately to his name, a hesitation barely perceptible yet now magnified into significance. A sunny garden appearance, once a cheerful tableau for photographers, revealed his gaze lingering somewhere distant for too long. The pauses that had previously passed unnoticed now seemed loaded with meaning. Each misstep, each moment of delayed reaction, formed a pattern she could no longer ignore. She began to see what had been whispered by instinct, the subtle signals she had been trying to rationalize away. Something was different, something required attention. Finally, she demanded answers. Comprehensive evaluations were requested, discreetly and privately, far from the glare of the public eye and the polished narratives of the palace. She sought clarity rooted in fact, in medicine, in truth, not in carefully constructed reassurances or bureaucratic spin. Tests were ordered, specialists consulted, consultations arranged. But then the process stalled. Appointments were postponed without explanation. Additional reviews were suggested, then pushed further into the bureaucratic machinery of palace protocol. The reasoning was always wrapped in elegant language about discretion, timing, and privacy, but the effect was unmistakable. Progress slowed, precious time slipped through her fingers. It was becoming clear to Catherine that the institution, so masterful at controlling image and perception, was measuring optics against urgency, appearance over reality. Each delay, each deflection, each carefully crafted phrase felt less like protection and more like control. Every request for action, for transparency, was met with caution, with soft resistance, with reminders that acting independently could spark unnecessary speculation or even scandal. The palace cared less about her child than it did about the story the outside world would see. Tension tightened like a wire behind closed doors. Conversations with senior aides became sharper, edged with polite warnings and subtle threats, silences loaded with meaning. One evening, driven past the edge of endurance, Catherine confronted them in a private office. Her voice, though trembling with frustration and fear, was steady and commanding. She demanded truth. She demanded explanation. She demanded prioritization of her son's well-being over the carefully constructed image of royalty. But the answers were empty. They came in rehearsed phrases, in clipped reassurances, in evasive language. They did not comfort. They did not resolve. They only reinforced the reality that her son's welfare had become subordinate to procedure, tradition, and optics. William watched, caught between love and duty, between instinct and obligation. He saw his wife unravel before him, her face taut with fear, her hands trembling from suppressed panic, her body weighed down by worry only a mother could feel. And yet he was a future king, trained to place trust in the institution that had guided his family for generations. He counseled calm, he advised patience, he urged faith in the process, believing in the structure that had upheld them all for decades. But even he could no longer ignore the cracks. The briefings that had once seemed so complete now felt hollow, lacking substance beneath their polish. The reassurances once meant to soothe now rang false. For the first time, William glimpsed the harsh reality. The palace was a machine capable of prioritizing legacy over life, image over truth, tradition over compassion, and in that moment, the most sacred part of their world, their child, was exposed to the consequences of that machinery. The walls that were meant to protect instead constrained, delayed, and endangered. And the parents who had trusted them implicitly were left to navigate the terrifying space between instinct and authority, between love and protocol, between truth and control. Catherine felt it in every fiber of her being. She was not merely navigating a crisis, she was confronting a system that had, slowly and quietly, placed her son at risk. The bond she shared with Louis screamed at her to act, to fight, to insist, but the palace whispered back with rules, tradition, and restraint. The struggle was only beginning, and the path forward was fraught with obstruction, silence, and opposition. And yet no institutional barrier could erase a mother's intuition, or the fierce, relentless drive to protect her child at any cost. The situation, once confined to the quiet halls of the palace, had now erupted like a storm breaking over calm seas. Catherine felt the world shift beneath her feet. The encrypted message that reached the journalist had done more than leak information. It had detonated a chain reaction that none could contain. The files were meticulous. Internal medical records, specialist notes, dates of tests, assessments of subtle behaviors, and documented disagreements over what, when, and how to disclose. Every line revealed a truth carefully kept from the public eye. Every detail carried the authority of someone inside the palace, someone who had witnessed the slow, painstaking documentation of a reality far harsher than the curated image the world had been allowed to see. Within hours, the world reacted. Headlines screamed across newspapers and digital feeds alike, flashing in homes, cafes, offices, and phones. Social media erupted with hashtags, viral clips, and urgent speculation. The leak transformed private concern into a global spectacle. The content confirmed Catherine's deepest fears. Louis had a rare, progressive neurological condition, genetic in nature, one that would demand careful management for the rest of his life. But the shock did not stop there. The documents revealed that the palace had known weeks ago. The delay in communication, the careful silences, and the bureaucratic pauses were no longer theoretical or frustrating. They were now undeniable. What had been a private worry had been mishandled, and that mishandling was now public. The palace reacted with its usual precision, but it was too little, too late. Communications teams were called immediately, staff rushed to draft and refine statements, and advisors convened in emergency sessions to plan damage control. Every press release was debated, every word weighed against perception, every sentence considered for its impact on image rather than truth. Yet the public moved faster than any statement could contain. The palace's machinery, so adept at managing appearances, could not outrun the viral tide of outrage, speculation, and curiosity. Catherine learned of the leak in the most impersonal way possible. A notification blinking on her phone, a headline she had neither authorized nor prepared for, demanded her attention. Fury swept through her, a complex and layered emotion. She did not rage at the journalist, nor even at the leak itself. Her anger was directed at the silence that had forced someone to act in the shadows, at the institution that had delayed transparency long enough for desperation to be the only path to truth. The very system she had trusted had created the circumstances for chaos, and now the consequences were public, unavoidable, and undeniable. When the full medical briefing was finally presented, stripped of omission or ambiguity, the impact was devastating. Louis's condition was rare, progressive, and without cure. Early intervention could offer support, but outcomes remained uncertain. Every milestone, speech, motor development, cognitive growth, would require continuous monitoring, intensive therapy, and specialized care. The life Catherine had envisioned for her son, full of exploration, laughter, public milestones, and family memories, now needed to be reshaped around treatment plans, private appointments, and meticulously managed progress. The vibrant child the world adored would now navigate a path defined less by spectacle than by survival and support. Her grief was raw and all-consuming. It did not ebb quietly. She cried, screamed, and clutched her chest as though the act could draw out the unbearable pain lodged within her. "Not him," she whispered into the empty room, voice breaking. "Anyone but him." The words encapsulated the entirety of a mother's anguish, a grief both personal and uncontainable. William's reaction was different, simmering and controlled, but no less intense. Rage coursed through him, not at Catherine, not at fate, but at himself for trusting too easily at the advisors who enselled patience instead of urgency, at the palace that had allowed delay to overshadow action. For the first time, the institution he had revered, that he had been trained to respect, revealed itself as a machine capable of putting image above immediacy, legacy above life. It was a revelation that shook him to his core. The diagnosis marked a turning point for the family. Louis's life would revolve around therapies, interventions, and ongoing assessments. Royal appearances and obligations, once carefully choreographed, would require reconsideration or outright abandonment. Public exposure would give way to private milestones, measured quietly behind palace doors rather than displayed for cameras. The boy who had once graced the balcony with effortless charm would now traverse life in increments, each step meticulously planned, each achievement weighed against uncertainty. And still the palace moved. Behind gilded doors, meetings proceeded with clinical efficiency. Conversations focused not on care, compassion, or maternal insight, but on optics, continuity, and succession. Every adjustment to roles and responsibilities was discussed in cold, procedural terms. Publicly, unity was projected with flawless polish. Privately, fractures widened imperceptibly, threatening to erode years of careful narrative construction. Catherine discovered that in her absence, crucial discussions about her son's future had been conducted in her name but without her presence. Decisions were being made about roles, responsibilities, and the public perception of the family without consulting the mother whose instincts had guided Louis's well-being for years. Her grief transformed into determination, a quiet but unyielding force. This was no longer only about a diagnosis, it was about agency. It was about refusing to let her child's life be reduced to a statistic, a procedural detail, or a strategic variable. The storm that had begun in the stillness of a palace room was gathering strength, building momentum, and spilling into every corner of their lives. And for the first time, Catherine moved from reaction to preparation. She was no longer simply a mother confronted by crisis. She was a force preparing to fight for her son, for truth, and for the right to defend the life that had been entrusted to her care. Every instinct, every resource, every ounce of resolve would now be brought to bear. The quiet, methodical world of the palace had underestimated her, and she would ensure that it would not happen again. Would you like me to continue and expand the next part, where Catherine begins actively confronting the palace politics and institutional resistance? You have not enough humanizer words left. Upgrade your surfer plan.